Have you ever wished you could travel back in time? Well, in a way you can. Today, we're exploring how ancient art is like a time machine, one that can reveal the hidden social life of civilizations from thousands of years ago. So put yourself in a historian's shoes for a second. Your crime scene is the distant past. You don't have any living witnesses, no social media feeds to scroll through, just fragments. How in the world do you figure out the power struggles, the class divides, the rules of men and women? Where do you even start looking for clues? Well, the answer is literally carved in stone, because art is so much more than just decoration. For historians, it's one of the richest, most revealing documents a society leaves behind. It's a visual record of who was in charge, what people truly cared about, and how they saw their world. You know, for the longest time, we mostly studied ancient art for its beauty or its style, but today, scholars are doing something really different, something much more exciting. They're reading early Indian art like a social archive, uncovering this incredibly complex world of class, gender, and power that you just can't find in written texts alone. The brilliant scholar Vidya Deheja calls these layered narratives, and that's the perfect way to put it. Think about it. Every single sculpture isn't just telling one story. It's this dense web of information about who paid for it, who carved it, and who it was made for. All right, so let's jump back in time to the Mauryan Empire around the 3rd century BCE. This period is absolutely fascinating because you see two totally different kinds of art existing at the exact same time, one for the empire and one for everybody else. On one hand, you've got the imperial art. This stuff is state-sponsored, made of this incredibly polished stone, and it's all about projecting moral authority. It's very standardized, very serious. But then, on the other hand, there's popular art. This was community-based, often roughly carved, and just bursting with life and energy, celebrating fertility and local beliefs. Two completely separate worlds, living side by side. So that imperial art, it was basically a tool of the state. As the historian Ramala Thapar puts it, those famous Ashokan pillars weren't just monuments. They were a political messaging system, a network of markers designed to visually stitch the entire empire together under one single universal moral code. But popular art tells a completely different story. Vidya Deheja calls it the lived art of ordinary people. This art wasn't about some grand imperial ideology. No, it was about the everyday spiritual lives of merchants and villagers, centered around these powerful local deities they cared about. And at the heart of this popular art were figures called yakshas and yakshis. Now, these were powerful nature spirits. They were all about fertility, abundance, and the earth. They actually predate many of the big Brahmanical gods, and they were especially important to the merchant communities, who saw them as protectors of their wealth and prosperity. So what happens after the Mauryan Empire falls apart? Well, without that single central power, artistic creativity just explodes. Art production becomes way more community-driven, and this is especially true around these massive Buddhist monuments called stupas. Now, a stupa isn't just some religious building. In this era, it became a huge social project. The best way to think about it is like a community center, an art gallery, and a place of worship all rolled into one, funded and decorated by a whole cross-section of society. And this is where it gets really incredible. Just look at who is paying for this art. Inscriptions on the stupas tell us it wasn't just kings anymore. It was merchant bankers, artisan guilds, monks and nuns, the wives of traders, even perfumers, and the guys who led the trade caravans. I mean, this is stunning proof that art wasn't just for the elites anymore. The scholar Gregory Chopin has the perfect term for this. He calls it a democratization of art production. And it makes total sense, right? When you have so many different people chipping in, the art itself starts to change. It begins to reflect the stories and the identities of all these diverse communities, not just one single top-down imperial vision. Okay, so now we know who was funding this new art, this rising merchant class, guilds, religious communities. So now we can zoom in on the carvings themselves and see how their values are actually reflected. And this becomes crystal clear when we start to decode how they depicted gender. Because when we look at women in this art, a really fascinating and kind of complicated tension pops up. On the one hand, they're shown as powerful, active members of society. But on the other, they're often depicted as these idealized symbols of beauty and fertility. It creates a real paradox. You can see this paradox so clearly. On one side, women had real agency. We know they were patrons with their own economic power. Their names are right there in the inscriptions. But on the other side, they were also symbols. They were carved as these beautiful, auspicious figures that represent fertility, things that were super important to the merchant patrons, but often in ways that really cater to a male gaze. Vidya de Hagias sums this up brilliantly as the paradox of visibility. Women were culturally central. They were seen as essential for prosperity and good fortune. But that very visibility, being put on display, also acted as a form of social control, defining their roles in very specific, symbolic ways that served the worldview of the patrons funding the art. Okay, let's pull all these threads together. What is all this evidence telling us? Well, the big takeaway is this. Art wasn't a monologue shouted from the top down by the powerful. It was a dynamic conversation, a real negotiation between all the different groups in society. So if you want to try reading art like a social historian for yourself, and this is a great tool if you're a student, here's a simple 3-step guide. First, ask, who paid for it? Was it the state, a guild, an individual? Second, analyze the style. Is it that polished imperial look, or is it earthy and popular? And third, decode the narrative. Who's being shown, and what does that tell you about their status? And this brings us to our final and most crucial point. The art of this period, especially what we see at the Great Stupas, was a physical manifestation of a social negotiation. It was a space where powerful monks, wealthy merchants, organized guilds, and local bigwigs all sort of jostled for influence and carved out their identity in stone. Which leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question. 2,000 years from now, when historians look back at our time, what social secrets are they going to find embedded in our public monuments, our corporate logos, our digital art, even our selfies? What story will our pictures tell about us?